were inserted in the vaginas of women that had had sexual relations with the devil, anally on men that had performed homosexual acts, and in the mouth of people that blasphemed the church.
In ancient times and in medieval Europe, women were subjected to torture that will give you chills when you think about them. Imagine being forced to ride a wooden frame with a sharp ridge on it, or facing the gruesome fate of being sawn in half, all due to a neighbor's accusation of witchcraft. In this video, we will highlight some of the most terrifying punishment for women.
Are you guilty or not?
Spanish donkey. Chapters of history can be cruel and dark, revealing how imagination can turn a pleasurable attraction into suffering. Riding a horse may be enjoyable, but climbing atop a Spanish donkey is a highway to hell, each movement plunging you deeper to the abyss of discomfort or death. Commonly known as the wooden horse, it was first adopted by the Holy Inquisition in France and then in Germany and Spain, gaining much prominence during the colonial period. It was brutal, as it ensured maximum pain on the victims by cutting their bodies into half, starting from their genitals. Constructed in the form of a horse, the wooden planks are nailed together to form a sharp ridge, which would serve as the horse's back. These were supported by 4 legs fixed to a stand, some 6 or 7 feet high, with wheels fitted to the bottom of the legs so the entire device could be rolled across the floor or ground. It had a head and a tail attached to it, giving it the appearance of a fun wooden horse. The offender would be forced to sit on a wooden horse, sometimes with weights tied to their ankles and their hands bound behind their back. This caused the sharp edge of the wooden peg to press deeper, painfully cutting into their bodies, slowly tearing them apart. They were expected to maintain this position for hours, sometimes days, until they broke from severe exhaustion or were on the verge of being permanently disabled. The resulting injury results in severe to permanent damage to the genital area, most times leading to shock or death of the victim. Most victims would bleed to death while still on the wooden horse, and those who survived often succumbed to infections later or were left permanently crippled. It was easy to spot someone who had endured this torture by the way they walked, their posture forever altered by the brutality they had suffered. This is because a victim of the wooden horse could never walk the same way ever again with a guarantee of genital damage, a ruptured perineum, or a broken sacrum, a large triangular bone at the bottom of the spine. Women who were subjected to this would lose the ability to bear children. However, the wicked intention behind this punishment was nothing compared to the breast ripper. Ripping a woman's breast as punishment sounds unthinkable in our modern world, but in medieval times, this was considered a lawful form of justice. Commonly known as the iron spider, the breast ripper was one of those cruel instruments that truly makes you wonder how cruel and inhumane the lawmakers of medieval times could be. Designed to shred and tear the breasts of women accused of adultery, self-performed abortion, pregnancy out of wedlock, or erotic white magic. A suspect of this crime was tortured with the heated instrument. Its 4 claws would be clamped over her breasts, gripping it firmly. The torturer would slowly turn it and pull it, leaving her breast tissues completely ripped off. If she survived, her damaged chest would mark her for life. She would never be able to breastfeed her future children. Ridiculous as this may seem, in the 19th century, it was common to find unmarried mothers in some regions of France and Germany who had their breasts ripped out of their chests for one offense or the other. Moreover, breast ripping was a common method of torture used for interrogation and punishment during this period. However, in most regions of the world, the breast ripper was more often used to frighten the accused into a confession, rather than having the torture actually inflicted on them. The mere fact that it was ever devised reveals the depths of cruelty in medieval society, but in terms of sheer brutality and wickedness, you will get goosebumps watching the burning of witches. Imagine being bound to a stake with flames rising beneath you, all for a crime that would seem absurd or laughable today. In medieval times, it didn't take too much to be accused of witchcraft, and death by burning was the automatic judgment for whoever is found guilty. Cruel and horrific as it may seem, it was generally acceptable norm in the society then. Usually motivated by religious superstition, Witch hunters go about in search of people who have been labeled witches or are accused of heresy. In difficult times, such as years when there is an outbreak of disease, communities and regions would often look for supernatural causes. Witches were seen as one such supernatural cause. Anyone who had become sick or suffered an unexplainable misfortune might look for a mystical reason among the people around them. Accusations of witchcraft usually came from within the victim community. Most times they involved a dispute, after which one of the parties involved suffered some misfortune or ill health. People accused of witchcraft confessed under torture that they were guilty. Some also implicated other people, accusing them of also being witches. Ridiculous as this may sound, there was often little to no evidence against those arrested for witchcraft, beyond rumor and allegations that were hard to prove. This made obtaining a confession during interrogation vital to the trial. But what kind of confession could someone give under such cruel and horrifying circumstances? As absurd as it may seem, it was more terrible than the Swatch Bridal. Although scolding today may seem like sufficient punishment for a gossiper or someone deemed too loud, in 16th and 17th century England and Scotland, the Swatch Bridal was an instrument for taming such women. It was specifically designed to address the concern about women running out of control by, amongst other things, defying husbands, rioting, and challenging priests. There were common cases in medieval England where the victims of the bridal were involved in social protest, in dissenting religious movements, perceived as a threat to the moral or economic well-being of the community. Many of these women were also accused of witchcraft. When the Swatch Bridal is installed, the wearer could be led through town to show that they had committed an offense or scolded too often. This was usually done with the intention to humiliate them into repenting their alleged offensive actions. A spike inside the gag prevented any talking, since any movement of the mouth could cause a severe piercing of the tongue. When wearing the device, it was impossible for the person either to eat or speak. The goal wasn't to take lives, but to degrade women in society. The damage it caused to their self-worth struck deeper, leaving scars even more profound than those from the Iron Chair. Watching Game of Thrones takes you on a fantastical journey to claim the Iron Throne, but in medieval times, no one desired the Iron Chair because it was a symbol of torture and often death. Usually called the Chinese torture chair, it experienced its peak in popularity in Europe. This terrifying torture device featured hundreds of sharp spikes on the seat, back, arms, and legs of the chair. Although there were many different variations depending on the location, they consisted of about 500 to 1,500 spikes covering the whole chair, with a hole on the seat for fire and coal to be placed under. This description from an 1891 newspaper describes how it used to punish criminals, designed to kill by pressure against the sharp spikes. The victim was seated and sustained by the front bar of the chair, then by another vertical bar, while 2 rings fastened the ankles below. Physically, the victim's skin gets punctured while the person is tied down tightly onto the chair. If they do not cooperate, the person gets tied down tighter, digging the spikes deeper into their flesh. Underneath the seat was a stove with the fire burning beneath the victim to burn the victim's lower body parts and slowly roast them alive. This cruel device was used on convicted women or suspects because it instilled fear in them. It was basically used to extract confessions from them by watching another get tortured. If that failed, the person themselves had to suffer from it as well. The Iron Chair is one of those medieval devices that makes you grateful for how far we've come as a society. If being punished with something like this scares you, hold on. What would you think of the breaking wheel? Imagine being strapped to a massive hamster wheel left to spin for days, all because of a religious opinion. Sounds like a horror movie, right? But that was the reality of women in medieval times. Reserved for the worst criminals, the breaking wheel was designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering, often before a large crowd. Popularly known as the Catherine wheel, it crushes the limbs and bones of the condemned, sometimes over the course of several days. Women condemned to this punishment were either broken on the wheel or broken by the wheel. In the first, an authorized executioner dropped a wheel on the condemned to break her bones. In the second, the victim is tied to a wheel so that her executioner could systematically break her bones with a cudgel. Afterward, the victim would often be left on the wheel for hours, or even days, their broken limbs gruesomely intertwined in the wheel's spokes. Needless to say, it frequently took them a long time to die. Although it was initially reserved for slaves or heretic Christians, it later came to be used as punishment for crimes ranging from treason to murder. The breaking wheel eventually faded from use in the 19th century. However, the horror remains just as disturbing as the legacy of sawing a woman in half with a chainsaw. Ever watched a carpenter saw through a piece of wood? Imagine a woman being tied upside down and cut in half the same way. Horrifying, right? Yet this was the grim fate of some women in the past for offenses we had hardly blink at today. In most cases, the victim is usually hanged upside down and sawn apart vertically through the middle, starting at the groin. While in other cases, the condemned person was apparently fastened to either one or two boards prior to sawing. Women convicted of witchcraft, adultery, or blasphemy are usually victims of this cruel method of torture. The victim is usually in a conscious state as the saw ripped through their body, cutting them in half. Sometimes the operations might take hours before the executioners cut through the victim. It was a pretty nasty way to die. Extreme and disturbing as this may seem, but what will blow your mind is the cruelty of the Pair of Anguish. A rumored torture device developed in 17th century Europe, it combined sexual violation and horrifying physical pain, making it one of the most brutal instruments of agony. Commonly called the choke spear, the Pair of Anguish was a torture device used to extract confessions from criminals. Depending on the nature of the crime, it was usually inserted in the mouth, anus, or vagina of the victim with the intention of inflicting maximum pain and discomfort. For instance, those convicted as heretics received the choke spear in their throat. Homosexuals and witches had it inserted in their vagina or anus, as the case may be. As the torturer turns the screw, the head of the Pair of Anguish expands, pressing against the walls of the victim's rectum or vagina. The pressure begins to build, and the victim feels like the metal is going to rip through the sensitive nerve endings, resulting in unending agony. The Pair of Anguish stands as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which humanity has gone in the name of punishment and control, especially on women. I wouldn't wish such a horrifying experience on my worst enemy. What's more chilling is the punishment of stoning to death. As ridiculous as this may sound, death by stoning is one of the oldest forms of execution in the world, and by all metrics of measurement, it is certainly among the most barbaric of all. Sentences were pronounced in public, and their implementation was announced in good time, so that everyone had the chance to come and watch the victim die. If convicted, a deep, narrow hole is dug. The woman is then tied up to her neck and inserted to the ground up to her head, exposing only her head. Members of the public and public executioners throw rocks at her until she dies. Although this method of execution is common in some parts of the Muslim world, it actually originated with the ancient Jews, who practiced death by stoning as a punishment for adultery. However, the Jews abandoned this practice in the 1st century. The victims are usually women. Oftentimes, these women are innocent but falsely accused of adultery by husbands who want to get rid of them. The idea behind this method is to bury the victim under a pile of stones. As the small stones build up around the victim's body, the crowd shifts to throwing larger stones until they are dead. Unfortunately, 15 countries still practice this method of punishment. Stoning to death may sound like the highest form of brutality, but the psychological effect is on par with the Republican marriage. It sounds lovely, but it's a horrific way to die. Republican marriage was one of the brutal punishments inflicted on women during the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution, leaving one to ponder the depths of human cruelty and wickedness. It was death by drowning. The moment a victim is fully submerged underwater, the process of drowning begins, and it's a race against time for survival. Usually, a Republican marriage was performed by tying a naked man and a naked woman together and then drowning them in the Loire River in France. These Republican marriages involve pairing two people of different genders, generally an old man and old woman, or a young man and a young woman, bereft of every kind of clothing together and letting them sink to watery graves. The outbreak of cholera and typhoid in prisons during the French Revolution led to the adoption of this cruel method of execution by French revolutionary Jean-Baptiste Carrier. He was credited with introducing this form of execution in Nantes, where he was responsible for quelling counter-revolutionary activities and establishing a revolutionary committee. Although it initially began as a night event in an effort to hide what was happening from other prisoners and the people of Nantes, Jean-Baptiste Carrier decided that wasn't good enough. He ordered Republican weddings to occur during the day as a way to deter anyone who wasn't dying of disease or in prison from doing anything that would put them in jail. It was a brutal period, marked by extreme measures meant to suppress any opposition to the revolution. The Republican marriages stand out as one of the many atrocities, reminding us of the darker moments in history. Unsettling and horrifying? What would you think of footbinding? Although throughout history, women have suffered pain and agony in the name of beauty, few practices can match the agony and lasting impact of footbinding. It is an old Chinese custom of wrapping a young girl's feet tightly in strips of cloth to stunt future growth of her foot. This practice was popular in China for many centuries and generally believed to have started as in the early 10th century. Although it originally began as a symbol of status among elites, the trend soon spread to all social classes and affected millions of women and girls over the next millennium. Small feet had quite a strong appeal for many men in China. The shape of bound feet and the pain they caused made women walk with a swaying gait, and men found this very attractive. Lotus shoes, special shoes designed to highlight the small size and unique shape of a bound foot, became a prized fashion accessory. To begin the binding process, the girl's foot was soaked in a mixture of animal blood and herbs to soften the skin and bones. Next, the toes were curled under the foot so that all her toe bones broke. The foot continued to be bent under until the arch of the foot also broke. Cotton bandages were wound around the foot to keep the broken bones tightly in position. The bandages had to be unwound at least every other day to clean the foot and check for infection, then rewound even more tightly. The broken bones would usually not heal for several years, and when they finally did, they were prone to breaking again later in life. Though this form of torture may seem unimaginable today, it highlights the extreme measures society has frequently taken in the pursuit of beauty. Footbinding is severe, and the boundaries of cruelty cannot go further than female circumcision. As surprising as it may seem, the practice of cutting female genitalia continues to be carried out by many people worldwide. The World Health Organization estimates that over 200 million girls and women have experienced some form of female genital mutilation before the age of 15. Also known as female genital mutilation, it's a procedure where the female genitals are deliberately cut, injured, or changed. Most common in the northeastern, western, and eastern regions of Africa and some parts of Asia, with the goal of discouraging the girl's sexual desire. Typically carried out by a traditional circumciser using a blade in unsanitary conditions with serious health implications. It is conducted from days after birth to puberty and beyond. And in many cases, this profession causes complications and infections resulting in death or severe injury. Common complications include bleeding, bacterial infection, and urinary problems, among others. The victims of this torture are no longer the same after this traumatic experience. Sometimes they suffer emotional difficulties throughout life, including depression and anxiety, nightmares, and other sleep problems. It's a harsh reality for millions of girls, but in today's world, there is thankfully a stronger focus on well-being and self-care. This form of punishment was both strange and cruel, leaving a lasting impact on women's sense of self-worth. Unlike the Iron Maiden. Imagine being surrounded by cold steel for hours. knowing fully well there's no escape. As terrifying as it sounds, the Iron Maiden was the ultimate symbol of fear, a medieval torture device designed to bring about a slow and agonizing death for its victims. It is a human-shaped box, decorated on the inside with incredibly sharp spikes that would, presumably, impale through the victim on either side when the box was shut. But the spikes were not long enough to kill a person outright. Rather, they were short and placed in such a way that the victim would die a slow and agonizing death, bleeding out over time. However, despite its terrifying reputation, the use of Iron Maidens as a torture device on women is considered a myth, heightened by the belief that people of the Middle Ages were cruel and uncivilized. Evidence of their actual use has never been found. Though the Iron Maiden may forever stand as a symbol of horror in our minds, women of medieval times feared it too. Facial disfigurement. The brutal practice of maiming women's faces in medieval times starkly highlights the depths of barbarism in that era, echoes of which still resonate in parts of the world today. Whilst men, too, might suffer some traumatic facial damage, the assumption that a woman's value is based on her beauty was, and still is, a strong element that has made them a constant victim of this punishment. The Central and later Middle Ages were periods of European history that saw a sharp increase of threatened and actual violence towards the body. The judge carries the right to punish a woman or men with facial mutilation as punishment, most frequently in criminal cases, such as theft or treason. Women found guilty of adultery are also subjected to this despicable treatment. In ancient Rome, cutting the faces of erring women was endemic in Italy at the time. This sort of case was called sfregio, which translated refers to both the act of slashing and the resulting scar. The most common cutting was to slice off the nose, a form of torture codified into English law in the 11th century during the reign of Knut. Recent archaeological evidence suggests facial mutilation had been used as a punishment far earlier. As we reflect on this dark chapter in history, face disfigurement serves as a stark reminder of society's obsession with female beauty and the violence inflicted on women to maintain control over them. It was the order of the day. The motivation was to cower women into submission with these tools of horror, among which was the ducking stool. The idea of policing and silencing women has been around way longer than you might think. Throughout the ages, women have faced cruel punishment for being themselves, including being subjected to water torture repeatedly against their will. Between the mid-16th century and the early 19th centuries, an untold number of English women underwent ducking as a punishment for speaking out of turn or gossiping too much. It was a ritual for slensing women. In towns across England, authorities kept ducking stools close at hand, typically consisting of a wooden or iron chair fastened to a beam from which the victim could be lowered into and raised out of the water. These seesaw-like contraptions were frequently mounted on wheels for easier movement, although some communities craftily stored them out of sight, ready to be moved to ponds or rivers at a moment's notice. Others proudly installed them in permanent waterside positions to be used when the need arose. Offenses punished with ducking stool included adultery, prostitution, witchcraft, and being an unruly individual in society. Brewers of bad beer and bakers of bad bread could also be ducked. Local communities also used ducking stools as deterrents. If a woman was deemed disruptive or too unruly, she might wake up one day to find a ducking stool leaning against her door, placed there on the orders of local authorities. If this was hard to watch, you might not be able to eat your next meal after watching. The stocks. Imagine visiting the market on a Saturday and spotting your neighbor pinned down by a plank at his feet in the market square, a large letter D for drunkard perched on his head. A crowd gathers around him, pelting him with tomatoes, adding to the chaos. Stocks were instruments of public embarrassment and humiliation. They are made of wooden or metal devices with footholes used as punishment until the beginning of the 19th century and were used to restrain offenders' feet and hold the legs straight out, while people threw rotten vegetables at them. The punishment was supposed to be a public one, thus the person in the stock was almost always subjected to humiliation from the people that lived in the area. This accounts for the reason the stocks were located in the marketplaces. Typically, the condemned would wear a letter on their clothing to signify their crime. An adulterer would be marked with an A, a blasphemer with a B, a thief with a T, and a drunkard would also bear a D. In some cases, these letters were even branded onto the condemned's face. One common reason why every town and village in England had stock solely because of the status of laborers enacted in 1351 against unruly women, vagabonds, and drunkards. If a woman is troublesome, unruly, or if a worker refuses to work, the resulting punishment is usually confinement to the stock. This usually meant confined to the stock by their feet or fingers, depending on the weight of their offense. Think this punishment was degrading? What's worse is the pillory. The pillory was the same idea as the stock, but unlike the stock, the head and the arms were what went inside the wooden frame, a higher level of punishment for laughable crimes. The pillory was a lot more uncomfortable than the stock. The reason was that a person had to bend forward in an extremely awkward position. Some offenders do have their ears nailed to the board of the wood. Rotten tomatoes and buckets of blood were often thrown at someone, but sometimes the missile of choice was animal or human excrement. The pillory was designed to punish well-known people in society. Women, particularly those who were outspoken critics and branded as blasphemers, often found themselves subjected to this form of humiliation. Weekends were typically chosen for these events, as they attracted larger crowds. What happened to the condemned person often hinged on the mood of the onlookers, turning the event into a spectacle that people eagerly anticipated. Some victims were pelted with tomatoes, while others faced more brutal outcomes, with stones being thrown that could cause serious injury or even death. In the United States of America during the 1800s, the individuals most frequently subjected to the pillory were slaves. These individuals were often fastened to the device and flogged while exposed to the crowd. This torturous apparatus was commonly found in fields and barns throughout America. The pillory was a despicable means of punishment, but more despicable was the garrote. Largely recognized as one of the most brutal execution methods in history, the garrote was specifically designed to inflict intense suffering and pain. This method often resulted in prolonged death, allowing the condemned to endure significant agony before finally succumbing. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, the garrote was used in Spain as a method of delivering a merciful death to both men and women who repented of their heresy. During the Spanish Inquisition, rather than burning alive with the unrepentant, they were mercifully strangled with a sharp cord. It was a cruel and painful way to execute offenders, affecting both men and women alike. The general theory behind the garrote was that when the screw was tightened, it would crush the brainstem and kill the inmate instantly. However, if the screw missed the precise point where the brain meets the spinal column, it would simply bore into the condemned neck while the iron collar strangled him. This method typically involves strangulation, which can prolong the victim's agony as it often takes a significant amount of time for them to die. The basic account of the garrote execution reveals that the victim was forced to lean back against an upright board while sitting on a stool. The executioner stood behind the victim and turned a long wooden bar to tighten the wooden collar until the victim's neck was broken. The collar was strengthened with iron or brass strips. When the collar was tightened, a large screw protruding from the backboard of some chair models would push into the spinal cord of the sitter and enter his neck. But today, these ancient and inhumane methods are relegated to history books as we continue to wrestle with our definitions of justice and mercy. While the garrote may no longer claim lives, its shadow lingers as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.